So far, we've been talking a lot about how institutions and sort of the structure of how we set things up affects negotiations, but we haven't talked a lot about culture and how culture affects negotiation. This ends up being a pretty important thing to consider, particularly in international negotiations, because culture affects all sorts of human interactions, right? What we do and how we behave communicates different things. And when we're working across cultures, some of what we're communicating with our hand gestures, with our interactions, with our reactions to things can communicate information either intended or unintended, and positively or negatively. Oftentimes, the reasoning processes that we use are culturally constructed. This is I think something that people don't often realize. In the West, particularly the United States, reasoning processes are intended to be very linear, right? You are supposed to draw, a line from point A to B to C to D to E, and anything that is extraneous or maybe takes you off that chart, that track, is viewed as inefficient and distracting from the argument that you're making. Whereas maybe in a more Russian style of argumentation, the idea is that you start here, but you sort of wind around and around and around, and you draw in additional things, and you go on tangents, and you tell stories, and you engage in different things, and you end up over here. And there's no straight line. There's not even a connection between very many of the things that you talked about. But what you've demonstrated is that you are aware of all of this other stuff, this broader context, and you should believe this person who has told you this long, windy story, not because they've laid out a linear path, but because they've demonstrated to you that they understand all the connections, right? That's a very different mode of reasoning, and it annoys the heck out of people who are like focused on that linear path, and vice versa, right? If that's how you think about reasoning, that it has to be this broad demonstration of that you know and understand all the complexity and the nuance, and somebody gives you this very, line by line by line, connection by connection by connection story, it's going to feel very thin and very unconvincing. Likewise, concepts of fairness or justice or legitimacy, they're all things that are rooted in culture and have different meanings in cultures, and even just basic assumptions about how things are supposed to work, right? Do you go out drinking at the start of negotiations, or do you go out drinking after negotiations to celebrate, right? When do you go out drinking with negotiations is something that's culturally constructed and can create confusion amongst parties about how things should work. I'd also point out that culture really defines like what we can actually negotiate around. That every culture, every society will put limits around what is negotiable. And so the example I always use of this is that in the West, it's currently the case that children are considered to be outside the bounds of what you can negotiate over, right? That you're not supposed to sell your children. People say things like, oh, I love all of my children equally. Like the idea that you would ascribe value, utility, like dollar amounts to children is considered horrific in many Western societies, and yet that's not how it's been throughout all of human history. That's not even how it was in my family. My grandfather very much assigned financial value to my father. It was in form of life insurance. He was very upfront. Like, if you die, that's money out of my pocket. The idea I'm getting at here is that if you can put a dollar to something, you can negotiate around it. You can use it for a bargaining piece, or you can make a concession on it. But cultures define things that are just outside that, right? That we don't necessarily put a dollar value to religion or to honor or to various different customs or practices. And different cultures are going to have those lines drawn in different places, and that's going to affect negotiations. There's also a really common way of sort of talking about different cultures that pops up in negotiations. And so we'll talk about individualistic cultures and communal cultures or communal societies here in a little bit. But to kind of give you a sense of what this looks like, this is I guess, shaded map of Geert Hofstede's individualism measure that he generated in the 1970s, where the darker green represents countries that are more individualistic, and the paler kind of yellowish represents countries that are less individualistic, more communal. We can talk about why that matters for negotiations, but I think at this point I should probably flag that while I think Geert Hofstede's measure more or less aligns with what we think from a variety of different sources about which places are more individualistic and more communal. The data's got kind of a weird history. He based it on a survey of IBM employees that was conducted globally, and he separated out sort of what's the career of different people. So are you a software engineer versus a janitor? And sort of assume that because these are all IBM employees, they all have sort of the same IBM culture, and any differences that he saw between folks in Pakistan versus folks in Brazil in terms of how they answered this battery of questions, he said, well, that must be the national culture that I'm picking up on that, and therefore he determined that some countries are more individualistic and some are more communal based on a survey of IBM employees in the 1970s. We'll take that for what it is. That having been said, there's a reason why we might want to pay attention to whether countries are more individualistic or communal. And part of that is that in individualistic societies, we tend to think about negotiations as involving individuals, right? Each person is an independent actor. They're self-determining, right? They interact in a way that is disconnected from the broader society, right? I am representing myself. I'm not representing my family. I'm not representing my ethnic group. I'm representing me when I sit down to conduct business. And we can have business on, and we can conduct business on the grounds that this is mutually beneficial for us in a financial sense. Our business interactions don't imply anything about our social interactions, right? So in the United States, we have the expression, it's not business, or it's not personal, it's business, right? To sort of reflect that idea that I can separate out negotiations over financial material interests versus my social well-being and my social interactions that I have. In individualistic societies, people tend to thrive on conflict and debate and arguing. There's maybe a valuing of straight talk, and that it's generally considered desirable that you would confront problems directly to work through them. And we also attribute trust and whether somebody can be trusted to their own behavior, right? That simply because I have the last name Erlacher doesn't mean anything to people in terms of whether or not I can be trusted. They're not going to use my father as a proxy or my uncle or my cousin as a proxy for whether or not I can be trusted. My trust comes from me, I guess. So individualistic societies really sort of pull the individual out of the social context that they're operating in, and then tries to negotiate through that sort of frame, whereas more communal societies are going to have a harder time disconnecting the individual from the social relationships that individual is embedded in. And so interactions can't be just business and not personal. If an interaction goes badly, that affects the individual as a person, right? And so there's this concept of losing face, of losing esteem or prestige within a community. Shame might be a very powerful motivator, or honor for a family or community or group. That it's not possible to have interactions that aren't going to touch on these broader social networks that we're embedded from. And that's actually the source of trust, right? My ability to trust you comes from the fact that you have a community around you that I am going to be interacting with and has a vested interest in making sure that we have a positive interaction. That trusting somebody who is not embedded in the community is a complete and total gamble, because you don't know that person and that you don't know their community. Communal societies also maybe emphasize the harmony of the group, that you have people living in close quarters and very reliant upon each other, and those social networks are very dense. Open confrontation can be dangerous. It can be dangerous to the functioning of the community. And so disagreements may be suppressed, and bringing up disagreements or different perspectives or positions can be viewed as threatening to the cohesion of the group. It may be very socially difficult to say no in a communal society, because saying no might imply lack of deference to social relationships. And so there may be a kind of hedging or hemming and hawing or let's wait and see kind of interaction there that folks from more individualistic societies find inefficient, right? And folks in communal societies might be very attuned to hierarchy. They might be very attuned to rank or position or relative status because that gives them a sense of how those social relationships work out. In individualistic societies, rank and hierarchy and those things matter a heck of a lot less than the interaction the individual is bringing to the table. So there's a whole host of reasons to think that different societies and different countries even might approach negotiations very differently based on culture. On the other hand, it's very easy to overstate how big of a factor culture is in international negotiations, in part because there's also a international diplomatic culture. And leaders are able to code switch, right? They're able to flip between how they need to engage with their domestic audiences, their people from their own country, and how they need to engage when they're operating internationally, right? And so many leaders are Western educated from countries that are, not in the West. So they're familiar with those individualistic types interactions and that sort of Western focus on straight talk and disassociating the individual from the community that they're embedded in. And leaders and diplomats get socialized in these international norms. They understand how to flip between those. People are not inflexible automatons who are incapable of working through cultural differences. They figure it out, and even if they make mistakes the first time through those interactions, that second pass, they're going to be more attuned to those differences and how to adjust and accommodate to make sure that those interactions proceed positively. So there's also an argument to be made that international culture or cultural differences maybe complicate things, but we shouldn't assume that that's a barrier that human beings can't work through and manage.